On an ordinary morning in February 1965, Malcolm X knew that something was closing in. The threats had become more direct. His home had already been attacked. Men were watching him. People close to him had warned that his life was in danger. And Malcolm himself had begun speaking as though he did not expect to live much longer. Then, on February 21st, 1965, he walked into the Audubon Ballroom in New York City. Minutes later, he was dead. The official story focused on the gunman inside the hall. But behind that moment was another story. A story written across thousands of government pages, pages covered with black ink, names hidden from the public, paragraphs removed, and words such as secret, confidential, cross-references. For years, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been collecting information about Malcolm X. Agents followed his speeches. Informants entered the organizations around him. Reports documented his movements, his meetings, his travels, and the people who stood beside him. So the question is not whether the American government knew who Malcolm X was. It knew him in extraordinary detail. The deeper question is this: what did America know before the assassination? And what did it do with that knowledge? To understand why Malcolm became the subject of such intense surveillance, we must return to the beginning. Before he became Malcolm X, he was Malcolm Little. He was born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1925. His father, Earl Little, was a Baptist minister and a supporter of Marcus Garvey's movement, which promoted black pride, independence, and a return to Africa. The family lived under constant racist pressure. Their home was threatened, their movements were watched. And when Malcolm was still a child, his father died under circumstances that remained deeply suspicious to the family. The official explanation described the death as an accident, but Malcolm's family believed that white supremacists had killed him. After his father's death, the family began to collapse under poverty and government intervention. Malcolm's mother, Louise, struggled to hold the household together. Eventually, she was placed in a psychiatric institution and her children were separated. Malcolm moved through foster homes and schools. He was intelligent, ambitious, and one of the strongest students in his class. But when he told a teacher that he wanted to become a lawyer, the teacher suggested that such a dream was unrealistic for a black child. That moment stayed with him. It taught him something about the limits America had already prepared for him. As a young man, Malcolm entered the streets of Boston and New York. He adopted new clothes, new language, and a new identity. Crime eventually led him to prison. But prison did not end his story. It transformed it. Behind bars, Malcolm began reading constantly: history, religion, politics, language. He copied entire pages of the dictionary to rebuild his education. And through his family, he was introduced to the Nation of Islam and its leader, Elijah Muhammad. The prisoner who entered under the name Malcolm Little would leave as a different man. The surname Little, he believed, was a name inherited from slavery. He replaced it with a single letter: X, a symbol of the African name that had been erased. And when Malcolm X walked out of prison, one of the most powerful voices in modern American history was about to emerge. Malcolm X joined the Nation of Islam at a moment when the organization was still relatively small. He possessed something it urgently needed: discipline, intelligence, charisma, and the ability to turn complicated ideas into words that ordinary people could remember. He became a minister and organizer. He helped establish new temples. He recruited members. And in Harlem, he became the leading voice of Temple No. 7. His speeches were direct and uncompromising. He spoke about police violence, poverty, segregation, and the psychological damage caused by racism. He rejected the idea that black Americans should quietly wait for freedom. He attacked the language of patience. He challenged white liberalism. And unlike many leaders of the civil rights movement, he refused to present integration as the only possible future. For Malcolm, the problem was not simply that black people had been excluded from American society, The deeper problem was that the society itself had been built through slavery, violence, and racial domination. That message attracted large audiences. It also attracted the attention of the government. By the early 1950s, the FBI was building a detailed file around Malcolm Little, now known as Malcolm X. Reports recorded his position inside the Nation of Islam. They documented where he lived, where he spoke, who attended the meetings, what newspapers covered him, and which political groups attempted to contact him. To the public, Malcolm was a controversial religious and political speaker. Inside government documents, he increasingly appeared as a security subject, a man whose influence had to be measured, followed, and contained. The FBI was not merely collecting newspaper articles. Informants were providing information from inside meetings and organizations. Private discussions could become government reports. Internal disagreements could travel from a closed room into an official file. And Malcolm often seemed aware that people around him might not be what they appeared to be. The more famous he became, the larger the surveillance operation grew. Television changed everything. Millions of Americans who had never entered Harlem suddenly saw Malcolm X speaking on national programs. His confidence was impossible to ignore. He did not ask his interviewers for approval. He challenged their questions. He reversed their assumptions, and he forced white America to hear a version of the country that many preferred not to see. During the same period, the mainstream civil rights movement was organizing boycotts, marches, and non-violent demonstrations. Images of peaceful protesters facing police dogs, fire hoses, arrests, and racist mobs were reaching the entire world. Malcolm respected the courage of many of those activists, but he criticized leaders who, in his view, asked black people to remain defenseless while violence was being used against them. He did not teach aggression without cause. He argued for self-defense. He insisted that a person under attack possessed the right to protect his life. This distinction was often lost in the headlines. The press frequently presented him only as a symbol of anger. But the government understood that his power came from something deeper. Malcolm could connect local injustice to a larger political argument. A police beating in Harlem was not, in his telling, an isolated incident. It was part of a national system. Segregation was not simply a Southern problem, it was an American problem, and racism was not only a question of personal hatred, it was connected to housing, education, employment, policing, foreign policy, and political power. His language was becoming larger than the Nation of Islam. His audience was becoming larger than its membership. And that created a difficult situation. The organization had helped create Malcolm X. But Malcolm X was becoming a global figure in his own right. The FBI reports began documenting not only his growth, but the tensions surrounding that growth. The closer Malcolm came to the center of public attention, the more dangerous his position became. He was being watched by the government. He was attracting enemies outside the organization. And inside the Nation of Islam, his relationship with Elijah Muhammad was beginning to fracture. The break did not happen in a single moment. For years, Malcolm had publicly defended Elijah Muhammad with complete loyalty. He described him as a teacher, a leader, and the man who had rescued him from the darkness of prison. But behind the scenes, Malcolm was discovering information that shook his faith in the organization's leadership. At the same time, his own public influence was creating suspicion. Some inside the Nation of Islam believed Malcolm had become too powerful, too independent, too visible. Then came the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in November 1963. Elijah Muhammad ordered his ministers not to comment publicly. But during a speech in December, Malcolm described the assassination as an example of the chickens coming home to roost. The statement produced national outrage. Malcolm was suspended from public speaking. Officially, the punishment was temporary. In reality, it marked the beginning of the end. The government files followed the conflict closely. They documented public statements, organizational changes, and the people moving between Malcolm and his former allies. The state was watching a powerful movement divide from within. In March 1964, Malcolm announced that he was leaving the Nation of Islam. He established Muslim Mosque Incorporated. Soon afterward, he created the Organization of Afro-American Unity. His message was changing. But he was not becoming silent. He was becoming more ambitious. Malcolm began separating the religion of Islam from the racial theology he had learned inside the Nation of Islam. In April 1964, he traveled to Mecca and completed the Hajj. There, he prayed and ate beside Muslims of many different ethnic backgrounds. The experience did not erase his understanding of American racism, but it changed how he understood race itself. He wrote that he had seen sincere brotherhood among people who, in America, would have been classified as white. He adopted the name El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, and when he returned, he made clear that his thinking had evolved. He was still committed to black freedom. He was still willing to condemn American racism, but he no longer believed that every white person was automatically evil. This transformation made Malcolm more difficult to define, and perhaps more difficult to control. He was no longer speaking only to members of a religious organization. He was building relationships with African leaders, diplomats, students, activists, and journalists. He traveled across Africa and the Middle East. He attended international gatherings. He attempted to move the struggle of Black Americans from the language of civil rights into the language of human rights. That distinction was important. Civil rights could be treated as an internal American matter. Human rights could be brought before the international community. Malcolm wanted the United States to answer for racism not only in Washington, but before the world. The FBI documents recorded his international contacts and his attempts to influence African governments. His speeches abroad were collected, his statements were analyzed, his political relationships were mapped. The file continued to grow. But so did the danger around him. After leaving the Nation of Islam, Malcolm received repeated threats. His conflict with former members became increasingly public. He believed he was being followed. He spoke about possible attempts to poison him. He told friends and reporters that he expected to be killed. There were also people around Malcolm whose loyalties were unclear. Government informants existed inside political and religious organizations throughout that era. New York police intelligence units were also monitoring Black activists. The result was a world in which almost everyone suspected everyone else. On February 14, 1965, Malcolm's home in Queens was firebombed while he, his wife Betty, and their children were inside. They escaped alive. Malcolm publicly accused his enemies of trying to kill his family. Others accused Malcolm of staging the attack. The truth became buried beneath competing claims. But one fact was impossible to deny. 7 days before his assassination, Malcolm X and his children had fled from a burning house. The threat was no longer theoretical. It had reached his front door. And yet, on February 21st, Malcolm prepared to speak again. The Audubon Ballroom was crowded that afternoon. Malcolm was scheduled to address a meeting of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. His wife, Betty Shabazz, was in the audience with their children. Security around Malcolm had become a constant concern. But the atmosphere inside the hall was confused. Some of the men who normally helped with security were not present. Search procedures were limited, and Malcolm had reportedly asked that people not be treated as though they were entering a hostile place. He walked onto the stage and greeted the audience. Then a disturbance began near the back of the ballroom. A man shouted that someone had put a hand in his pocket. People turned toward the argument. The attention of the room shifted. At that moment, gunmen moved toward the stage. A shotgun blast struck Malcolm first. Then, other shots followed. The ballroom erupted into panic. People screamed. Chairs fell. Malcolm's supporters rushed forward. Betty attempted to protect their children while watching her husband collapse. Malcolm X was taken to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. He was pronounced dead shortly afterward. He was 39 years old. Police arrested one man at the scene, Talmadge Hayer, later known as Mujahid Abdul Halim. Two other men, Norman 3X Butler and Thomas 15X Johnson, were also convicted. They later became known as Muhammad Aziz and Khalil Islam. Both men maintained that they had not participated in the assassination. Hayer admitted his own role, but stated that Aziz and Islam were innocent. For decades, serious questions surrounded the investigation. Witness accounts conflicted. Evidence had not been fully disclosed. Information held by law enforcement agencies was not always made available to the defense. And the presence of informants inside the organizations surrounding Malcolm created even more uncertainty. In 2021, the convictions of Muhammad Aziz and Khalil Islam were vacated. The decision did not solve every mystery surrounding the assassination, but it confirmed that the original case had contained profound failures. Important evidence had been withheld. The wrong men had spent years carrying convictions for a crime they insisted they had not committed, and the official version of the case could no longer be treated as complete. This brings us back to the files. The documents do not prove that the FBI ordered the assassination of Malcolm X. They do not provide a simple page containing a command to kill him. History is rarely that convenient. But the files prove something else. The government had watched Malcolm for years. It knew about the divisions surrounding him. It collected information from inside organizations connected to him. It documented his movements. It analyzed his speeches. It followed his international travels. And it knew that his life was surrounded by escalating threats. After the assassination, the paperwork continued. Reports were written. Names were cross-referenced. Sources were protected. Pages were classified. Some information remained hidden for years. And every blacked-out section created another question. What had been removed? Whose identity was being protected? What did informants report in the final weeks? How much did federal and local agencies know about the men moving around Malcolm? And could any of that information have prevented what happened inside the Audubon ballroom? Malcolm X spent much of his life warning that America often hid violence behind official language. The files created around him seemed to reflect that same contradiction. Cold words, administrative numbers, confidential sources, routine reports. But behind those pages was a living man, a husband, a father, a leader who was changing rapidly during the final year of his life. Malcolm's story is sometimes reduced to a single image: the angry speaker, the man pointing through the air, the voice declaring freedom by any means necessary. But the final Malcolm X was more complicated. He had begun questioning old beliefs. He was building new alliances. He was connecting the struggle of Black Americans to anti-colonial movements around the world. And he was becoming a leader who could no longer be contained inside one organization or one political category. Perhaps that is why the final year of his life remains the most important and the most dangerous. The question is not whether America knew that Malcolm X was under threat. Its own documents show that it did. The question that remains is what America chose to do with that knowledge. On February 21st, 1965, the gunfire ended Malcolm X's life, but it did not close the file. More than 60 years later, the pages are still speaking. And somewhere between the names, the redactions, and the confidential reports, the full truth may still be waiting.